This passage is about the insurrection, the kind of rebellion, violence that happened in the US Capitol. Actually, the attack on the US Capitol building or the legislature building. He hasn't mentioned exactly that, he just mentions the word insurrection. The author mentions how it happened, how people were persuaded, were instigated by false news and to react with violence, and how one can ignore or look, how one can recognize false news, how what should the conditioning of a person be. He basically says when you read fiction, you know how an author builds a story, maybe truth but with fictional parts attached to it, how a good reader of fiction can find out the nuances of false stories and false news. So we'll read the passage quickly and summarize it, and then we'll look at the questions. In the US, we're feeling the sickening after effects of an attempted insurrection committed by people, many of whom before that day had never acted against their country or shown the least sign of being violent. We're talking of that one act of violence going against the country by people who'd never acted against their country, who'd never been violent. What's happening over here? Good question. The truth is, nobody knows. But here's one way of looking at it. These people were told a false story and acted on it with a level of passion and violence that would suggest true belief. So they were told a false story, but they believed and acted on it. They acted on it believing their action makes us believe that they thought that false story was true. They believed it. That false story, a set of false stories really bundled together, came to them via their news feeds and radio talk shows and partisan television shows with an alluring high-tech gleam. So how did they receive these stories? Through all these channels, right? News feeds, radio shows, TV shows, with all the high-tech involved in the glamour. In the face of this onslaught, their story receptors provided inadequate to the movement. You have story receptors, your mind proved inadequate to the moment, and they exhibited a failure of what Hemingway calls one's built-in shock-proof shit detector. We all have a built-in shock-proof detector of false news, but that day it failed for all these people. When they received the false news, they could not detect it, and therefore they acted on it violently. The stories these people fell for were laced with agenda, told with profit, designed to agitate, titillate, divide, and antagonize, thrown together quickly, misshapen by the demands of the delivery vehicle, which limited the number of characters used or prioritized likes and shares. So basically, this is we talking of social media, Twitter and WhatsApp and Facebook, maybe. The stories were laced with agenda. So there was an underlying agenda. There was a purpose to sending these stories. They were told for profit. They were designed to instigate people to rouse them to activity, and they were put together quickly because of the constraints of the number of characters you can use. They were misshapen, they were twisted, they were contorted, right, by the demands of the delivery vehicle. These stories entered the minds of their audience the way any story does, and their audience processed them earnestly as if there was something vital to learn in them, because that's what our minds do. So when we were told these stories, the people who reacted to it, they received it. They received it in the way anybody would react or receive a story. There are signs in a false story, tells we might call them, slight hitches in the language or logic of the story that someone versed in reading fiction comes to recognize. If you are versed, if you are used to reading fiction, you can see the hitches in the language. You can see the small changes in the language which will enable you to know the signs of a false story. We convinced by a passage in a story or not. By that, we learn that language comes especially alive when truthful. So you are convinced by a story or not convinced by a story, by the language. If that language speaks the truth to you, then it comes across. You're convinced by it. Our minds learn to sense when a narrative is in harmony with the actual and when it isn't. So our mind knows when a narrative is in harmony with the actual, with what is truth, and when it is not. Tom ran across the fresh cut grass, which smelled as all fresh cut grass smells of kerosene. Strikes us as false. Fresh cut glass doesn't smell as kerosene, like kerosene. This, written by Tolstoy, about two men riding through a blizzard in a horse drawn sled, strikes us as true. What is that? The snow was falling from above, sometimes rose from below. The horse was evidently exhausted. His hair had all curled up from sweat and was covered with hoarfrost, and he went at a walk. See the vivid description. There was snow everywhere, the horse was cold, the horse was wet, and it just couldn't move. Therefore it was not it was going at the pace of a walk. This resonates the truth with us rather than the passage on the statement on the grass smelling like kerosene, which is ridiculous. That rising of the heart to that second example is the feeling of one's bullshit detector being tuned. You know where the true story is, you know where it is. Who am I? Everybody. That is the idea on which fiction is built. You can relate to the story. You can relate to the characters of a story. I am everyone. Who am I? I am everyone. And that is the basis of fiction. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way to head off future insurrections, the way to prevent future insurrections, is to require all citizens to read classic short stories. So he's saying, I'm not saying that all citizens should read classic short stories. That's not what I'm saying. Not everyone is susceptible to fiction's charms. Not everyone likes to read fiction. And anyway, people have been reading literature before, during, and after every catastrophic period of history. And readers of literature have at times been leading the mayhem. So he says, I'm not saying that reading short stories, classical short stories, is the way to prevent insurrections. In fact, he says that readers of literature, people have been reading literature before, during, and after catastrophic events. And in some cases, readers have led the chaos during any insurrection. Yet, in this beautiful essay, This Is Water, David Foster Wallace talked about the power of choosing to subvert or interrupt our default settings. So there's this famous book, beautiful essay called This Is Water by David Foster Wallace, where he says, you can subvert, change, or interrupt our default settings on what to accept, what aligns with the truth and what doesn't. About consciously transforming our internal narratives regarding annoying people around us, those in those cars in that checkout line. So how we can change our internal narratives about people who irritate us. What went unstated? So in this essay, David Wallace Foster said this, but what went unstated but was implied in the passage is that immersion in art can be a way of training ourselves to enact this interruption of our default settings. If you're immersed in art, you can interrupt your default settings, you can change the narrative, you can change. This is the ending of the passage. Okay, all right. The author of the passage is most likely to support which one of the following statements? When you get this, that support statement will align with the author's main point. So, what did we learn in this? He gives the example of the insurrection at the US Capitol building. Why did it happen? Because of false stories. The people and then he says that was the second part, that they were fed false stories, that there was a purpose. There was a unstated purpose. The people who did it with a purpose, had a clear agenda on doing it. And they fed them false stories. They instigated the people, and people who'd never worked against their country, never opposed their country, or acted violently as a group. Then next he says, why did this occur? He says, when you read short stories and fiction, you automatically can see the language and can see the false stories in language. He gives the example of, we have a system which is tuned to know a false story, and one which aligns with the truth, which aligns with what we expect. And he gives the example of freshly cut grass smelling like kerosene, and the second one, the horse, Tolstoy's story, where we could relate to it, right? And then he says, I'm not saying everyone should read fiction. Not everybody is fond of short stories and fiction, but somewhere you can interrupt your default settings. You can change the narrative by by creating that kind of sense of knowing falseness. That's how he ends the passage. Therefore, let's see which one aligns with that main point. Education in the classics can alert people to false news. No, he doesn't talk of classics, he talks of classic short stories. And he doesn't say, I'm not saying everybody should read classic short stories. So he doesn't believe that just because people start reading short stories, classics. And here the mistake in this option is just talking about classics. When the author talked of classics, short stories, when you're used to reading fiction, you can identify what doesn't go with the truth. That's what he says. But he doesn't advocate that everyone should be educated in the classics. And classics isn't the word he used. He is more about reading short stories and fiction. The attempted insurrection in the US was a genuine attempt to subvert democracy. He didn't say that. That's an extreme statement. He said insurrection happened, and people who never attempted to subvert, never attempted to oppose their country, were instigated by false news to do so. Doesn't necessarily mean that it was a genuine attempt or could have been successful, right? It's an extreme statement. Most people will believe false stories if it is attractively packaged. Author says that in that case, false stories were shown through media, and people, because we are tuned to we take in stories, so people took in the story, right? And then he talks about knowing how what's a false story and what isn't, right? So why would he say most people will believe false stories? He says many of us have it in us. Those who read fiction can figure out false stories, right? So most people is not something he'll be agreed in. Those people who were part of that insurrection in the US, they were. Many others maybe, those who do not, but that does not mean most people would do it. People have an inbuilt instinct for recognizing false news. Yes, the quote of Hemingway tells that people have an inbuilt system. We have something in us which recognizes false news. He gives examples also and how that happens. Therefore, D is the correct answer.